And welcome back. So the rule of King Joachim was 35 years before the rule of King Zedekiah. So what we read in chapter 35 was a flashback. And I'm beginning to notice how the book of Jeremiah isn't quite chronological. I've noticed that there's a bit of back and forth, but I think it all serves to put the stories in context. Now, the Rechabites, were descendants of Jonadab, son of Rechab. They aren't technically part of the Israelites, but they are a nomadic tribe who lived alongside them for a long time. Their lifestyle was dictated by Jonadab, their ancestor, who taught them to abstain from wine, building houses, and engaging in agriculture. He was a strong opponent of Baal worship, and his instructions to his people was to guard them against getting involved in Baal worship. So he believed that these things that he told them not to do were the things that, ultimately, or maybe he had even observed all the nations and maybe the Israelites who worship Baal and saw that that was like a trend for them. All his descendants faithfully obeyed his instructions, which is why I felt like God wanted their story highlighted here just after he had spoken about Israel's disobedience, because remember, he had just spoken about how disobedient the children of Israel were. And then now, this is another tribe who weren't necessarily his people, but who were very obedient to what their ancestor had taught them. So the trap that, that was set for them, they didn't fall for it, right? Their faithfulness was an example and a rebuke to the people of Judah. If the Rechabites were willing to obey and follow the instructions of their earthly ancestors so diligently, how much more the Israelites should obey their God who created and redeemed them? It seems simple, right? But we know even in real life is not, so much so. God used the test of the Rechabites by Jeremiah as a basis for judgment. He would bring about the doom he had promised against Israel, but he'd promised the remnant of the Rechabites for their faithfulness. Now, this just shows us that outsiders are always welcomed into God's kingdom. Like this, obviously, we know that now under the dispensation of Jesus Christ, where you and I, who are necessarily Israelites, have been welcomed into the fold. But we see a foreshadowing of that here, because Rechabites weren't necessarily God's people, but because of their diligence and their obedience, and the fact that God used them as an example, he invited them in. God's command and Jeremiah's employment of Baruch to write all that the Lord had spoken to him through the years was interesting to me. Baruch acted as Jeremiah's secretary and assistant, and his writings took almost 1 year to do. Imagine that, writing for 1 year. I guess authors can relate. Jeremiah sent Baruch to read the scroll at the temple because he had been banned from the temple. Do you remember his temple sermon that we read about in chapter 7? Yes, so apparently as a result of that, he was no longer welcome at temple. The officials and princes realized the impact of Jeremiah's message, and they advised he himself and Baruch to go into hiding before the king was informed. And just as they suspected, the king destroyed the scroll bit by bit because it contained things that he wasn't trying to hear. God's word cannot be destroyed. The king burnt it bit by bit, but guess what? They wrote it again. And this time, they wrote it with even more detail added to it. The attempt to suppress God's word resulted in its increase, right? And the king's punishment from God was that he would have no son to succeed him on the throne. And Zedekiah reigned instead of his son. That was the king. That was, obviously, we're talking about Jehoiakim at this time. And instead of his son Jeconiah, it was Zedekiah, his uncle, who reigned in his place. Egypt's army appeared to have scared the Babylonians away, but it was just a temporary reprieve. God's judgment via the Babylonians was still going to happen, and we saw it happen. So I remember when I was reading Egypt coming, I was like, oh, what's about to happen? Oh, but I was like, no, you already know what the end is. But I mean, it's good to know that there were the people who probably have thought that, oh, the Egyptians could have saved them. But point though, this now gave me context into the things that we read even during the times of, or the prophecies of Isaiah, when he kept saying, you know, Egypt cannot help you, Egypt cannot save you. And I saw, okay, they thought Egypt could save them at this point. Jeremiah's imprisonment, this time in a dungeon, must have been very hard for him. But as we learned yesterday, God is a friend of prisoners. I love how God used an Ethiopian to rescue him from there. Even I understood that he wasn't totally freed because Hezekiah sought him for wisdom, even though he didn't obey. So even though the Ethiopian, if you remember the story, they brought him out of the dungeon, but he was still imprisoned in the king's court. So I feel like the king didn't want him to go too far because he knew he needed his counsel. So the king would go to him behind, you know, the scenes to ask for counsel, but he didn't necessarily obey him. And that was obviously to his detriment, as we'll come to see. So what did I learn about God from reading these chapters? God vigilantly protects his word. His words are powerful and cannot be destroyed. He wants us to know him, especially through his words, both spoken and written. Nothing stops his effort to speak to us. Even when it seems like God is silent, he's speaking, we're just not listening or tuned into his frequency. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will by no means pass away. That's God's word in Matthew 24:35. Yeah? So God's word is eternal. That's my lesson today. Looking forward to sharing with you tomorrow. We'll continue with the book of Jeremiah, and I'll share lessons from 38 to 40, and then we'll also read a couple of Psalms 74 and 79, which are related to those readings. See you here.